You're trained in literature, but your work moves fluidly across fields of the feminology, Marxist critique, medical humanities. How did you come to be interested in these questions of embodiment, toxicity, and speculative media?
Right.
Was
So my interest in the body, in fact, it didn't start with academia. It came from lived experience of having survived an eating disorder when I was very young. So I decided to, so for my PhD, I was already introduced to the kind of academic space of cultural studies during my MA at Temple. And so for my PhD, I decided to directly explore philosophies around embodiment. And so I was already reading modernist. It was actually a bit of a disappointment actually when I tell people that my PhD is on Virginia Woolf. So it was in British modernism and primarily the work of Virginia Woolf and post-impressionist art. But what drew me to Woolf was this peculiar configuration of the body through the use of tropes of disembodiment. So the concept of disembodiment or figures of disembodiment, figurations of disembodiment like the spectre, phantom, abjection, even non-normative registers at which bodies operate, wounding, injury, illness, to as ways of rethinking the anthropocentric humanist ideal of embodiment, and that's also a gender-based model of embodiment. Always. So that is what kind of drew me into continental philosophy. And I found Maurice Merleau-Ponty's work on embodiment as perception and embodiment as a mode of not just existing as an isolated subjectivity, but as a mode of interconnectedness and intertwining with one's ecological sphere as a useful tool to look to kind of re-examine these literary texts and to also rethink the formation of the literary body itself. So that's where my interest in the body started, and towards the end of the PhD, my last chapter, which was on the waves, I got interested in thinking about the non-human world. And also thinking of the body beyond the boundaries of the bounded human subject. So, and this is where I also started reading a bit of Deleuze and Guattari. So I think individuation, hexaity, multiplicity, and so on as ways of approaching and then sort of exploding this bounded concept or expanding the idea of body as something that is tied to only the human. So that's where it starts. And then the shift kind of took place for me mostly during COVID, where I got this chance to look at my own research in a systematic manner. And then I decided that I kind of wanted to move into areas that were more contemporary, one, and also to think about the implications of these philosophies for our sort of lived experience, right? The contemporary world, and also my own context as a South Asian scholar. So that is where I got into studying waste, and I was already looking at kinds of subjectivities or embodiments occupying the outside of hegemonic spaces and idioms. But I found waste, and so initially it was I was looking. It was through a purely eco-critical lens where I was thinking of waste simply as a byproduct of the capitalist scene, or as a byproduct of post-industrial modernity. However, as I researched, I kind of went forward with my thinking and scholarship, I sort of became interested in thinking of waste in different registers and so different dimensions of waste, where it's not just, it would be injustice to think of waste only as a kind of automatic fallout or byproduct of industrialization. Of course, there is a material reality to waste and there is a material agency to waste, which a lot of scholars are looking at. But I was more interested in thinking of the ecology of waste. So waste as an infrastructure, or waste as enabling, facilitating, and also preserving in many senses livelihoods, subjectivities again, but also sociological conditions. So cultures of waste. So that is where my research moved into. And then I also found that, especially with Sinha's work, and which is why Sinha's book has this kind of appeal for me, because it also explores how waste would become not only a critical heuristic with which to explore capitalist extractivism, but also and also neocolonial apparatuses of dumping and sort of territorial control via waste, which Max Libron talks about at length in her work, but also waste as a site for the generation of certain kinds of bodies. Precarious bodies, bodies around. So for me, Jasbir Kaur's idea of debility, that's why I found it very useful, because debilitated bodies, disabled bodies, but as having a kind of direct connection with waste and toxicity, as produced and but also sustained by waste. So that is where I mean, that's kind of where my interest in Sinha's work, because Sinha's work kind of ties these various threads together in the figure of the crypt subject, who is also quasi-human, or at least perceives himself as quasi-human. And also, but I also am a little wary of, and which is where speculative fiction holds this attraction for me, because I find that very generative for against it. So sort of we also need to be wary of reducing these subjectivities to a kind of doomsday scenario and looking at them only through the narrative of victimhood. What for me, as someone who studies cultural narratives, it becomes a space for the generation of alternatives. These could be forms of resistance, these could be forms of euphoria, of pleasure, but also of care. So kind of sociality, social spaces that form around blasted landscapes, as Anna Say calls it. So these kind of ecologies of waste and toxicity. So that is where currently, that's where my research, and I'm finishing my monograph on literary and artistic representations or engagements with waste. I'm also parallelly interested in narratives of non-human beings or non-human articulations. I'm also looking, and this is again very nascent, I mean, I'm not an expert at all, but I'm also interested in what is coming up as critical plant studies, looking at plants as generative of new kinds of philosophies, new ways of thinking about ideas of agency, identity, consciousness, sentience, and so on. So that's a small area of research. I'm trying to sort of move into that now and finding ways of putting toxicity and plants in conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful introduction to your work. You mentioned it earlier. Speculative fiction seems to be crucial to your critical method. What draws you to this form, and does this allow you to engage with unseen violences? I think you just mentioned that a bit, but could you expand on that point, sort of toxicity in ways that other maybe genres or methods might not, coming from your background?
So this is again something that is very basic to theories of speculative fiction, that the alternative worlds or the secondary worlds that we see in these narratives are both characteristic and exaggerations of the world that exists, but also provide new conceptual sort of departures. So they kind of allow us to conceptualize what we see and perceive around us in new ways. So it's always the lure of what can be, right? And this realization that what can be is in many ways what is. It is just that the what is often harbors the danger of repression and invisibilization. The what can be is explosive and it's eruptive. So that is one. The other is the kind of, so for me as somebody who's interested in bodies, the speculative world offers new ways of approaching the body beyond the human, beyond the anthropocentric. So the cyborg or the hybrid or and in a way that again alerts us to the dangers of something like technological utopianism. So that is the other. It's specifically in the case of waste and toxicity. It is again, it's sort of the speculative mode becomes a space for. There are two ways in which we could approach waste as something that is inevitable. So we kind of make our peace with it, we accept it. And the other is this tendency to invisibilize waste or to disavow waste. And Alexis Shortman talks about it in her book Against Purity. So that's the other problem, that we want to eliminate waste. Now, especially in the South Asian context or even in the global South, that comes with certain dangers of occlusion or erasure. Because if you want to invisibilize waste, you would also have to erase certain histories, certain social and economic concerns that are tied with waste. So speculative fiction gives that kind of not only legitimacy but also visibility to something that as a society we tend to, that's the kind of natural tendency to marginalize it or invisibilize it. Which is why in the essay, in my article on Indra Sinha, on animals people, I am kind of arguing against Nixon's idea of invisible slow violence, right, as forms of invisible violence. Because one of the things that one of the Probably, the potentials of waste is that it is very in your face. Even if you think of its sensory dimensions as an olfactory phenomenon, it is, you can't invisibilize it so easily. And that's something that I feel happens in the speculative space where waste acquires a kind of agency. And there is almost yes, there is a sense of there's almost an impossibility of curbing that. Also, it acquires that kind of that force where it becomes difficult to categorize it or to kind of curb it within existing epistemological systems. So yes, so speculative fiction does highlight the question of violence, including forms of invisible violence or slow violence. But for me, the interest is the kind of counter narrative, the counter agency that waste and toxicity acquires in, or even bodies associated with waste and toxicity acquired in these narratives, where it is not about invisibility. It is about the excremental. It is about that which places itself right, in our line of sight and makes its presence felt. And then what does it do to our ideologies of presence or, mattering? What matters? What we sort of what we want to see and what do we want to invisibilize? So that's where the speculative, I find it as a useful genre, but also as a space of criticality.
Yeah, in that article, Discard Ecologies in the Hyposubject 2024, reading of like Indra Sinha's Animals People is quite interesting in the sense that you also introduced the concept, as you're just mentioning, of excremental toxicity, waste that refuses erasure. And how does this concept like sort of function to challenge dominant narratives of environmental recovery and cleanup in a broader sense? And what were you trying to sort of do with that for our audience?
So now I am in Bangalore. So one of the things that I'm also trying to do in my work is relate the speculative to the live. And I'm also working with organizations that are sort of trying to rehabilitate waste workers or are working in close proximity with waste workers and addressing issues that are very pertinent to their everyday lives, including dignity of waste picking as a form of labor, questions of whether waste work should be formalized, what are the dangers of such formalization, social attitudes towards waste work, which are still quite questionable. The kind of, again, the dangers of bodily injury and harm, questions of infrastructure, etc. So, uh, so, so that being the kind of parallel ethnographic work that I'm interested in, I kind of see. So there are two ways in which I'm approaching the toxic in Indra Sinha's work. One is as chemical toxicants. So because this is a kind of a retelling of the Bhopal gas explosion, and it's set in that context. So the chemical register of waste, of course, it sort of becomes a dominant way in which waste and toxicity appears in this book. But the other is forms of poison or forms of contamination. That's why I'm using contamination as a rubric here. And which is kind of also bringing in, going beyond the narrative of environmental precarity, or which then sort of this whole idea of the human as the savior, and the idea of the human as needing to come and intervene and perform these acts of cleanup, which we know are they also have underlying again ideological issues, because I am very wary of this idea of a plastic-free world. Or I understand the need for it. I understand the need to advocate for removing, and I also understand where plastic as a material is coming from. It's obviously tied to histories of extraction, fossil fuels, petrochemical industries, and so on. So I do understand that, but at the same time, there is a certain privilege assumption to envisioning this world that is pure. Because we know this from Kusharma has done work on this, Vinay Gibani has worked on this, that this whole idea, the whole discourse of purity itself, of the sanitized society, it's sort of again embedded in discourses of caste, race, gender, even, and so on. So that predicament is something that I'm trying to address in this, where I'm looking at alternative registers of toxicity. Now that could come from language, So a certain kind of contaminated language that Sinha explores, where he's clearly challenging mainstream media journalistic reportage with animals, or janwar as he calls them, his kind of a deliberate use of a certain scatological discourse or references to the body, hypersexualized, innuendo-laden language. So language that it's in many ways it kind of performs that toxification on itself, and that I see as inaugurating a new kind of episteme. So sort of this whole idea that language itself is infected here. And so what kind of, if language is contaminated, what is this contaminated language? What does it look at? What kind of narratives does it allow to come through? So that is one. The other is at the level of language itself, but also at the level of the environment, at the level of the non-humans. So there's a part where I explored the Datura flower and these kinds of naturally occurring, and I don't talk about it in the article, but this distinction between the toxicant and the toxin, and how animal in a moment of acute distress mobilizes the power of this alternative poison to kind of inhabit this alternative world. Now, this is happening, obviously, of course, at the realm of the speculative, at the realm of the fantastic. But for a while, both in the case of Zafar as well as animal, it kind of allows them that consumption of that toxin ingestion. And ingestion then again is a form of bodily contamination, of welcoming the other. And I also look at this idea in the Shikara essay, that the other essay that I've recently written about South Asian forms of ideas of disease. So this idea of becoming this absolute host, or this idea of absolute hospitality, there is this idea of absolute hospitality where you open your body to the other. Can then, can poison or contamination or toxicity become a lens through which we can explore these philosophical concepts, and allows both these characters to experience something that goes beyond the human, the body, the anthropocentric. In the case of Zafar, it even adds up to a new kind of political resistance, because he's poisoned by his friend, and it happens while he's on this austerity, this kind of hunger strike. And if that is one mode of performative resistance or performative politics, ingestion actually becomes another form of political performance. So I'm also sort of looking at how Sinha resignifies the toxin itself, while acknowledging the harm and the injury done by chemicals and the industrial dimensions of it, but also can we rethink pollution itself? Can we rethink waste? So that's sort of what I'm trying to do in that book.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I've been trying to, think about animals, people in terms of the parable of the sour, Octavia Butler, where she's talking about hyper empathy in terms of this imagined sort of idea of 2024. The way these texts sort of redefine the concept of survival and resistance is very unique. I think Animal's character is not just sort of pushing us into this idea that we have to resist in a traditional sense, but because Animals is not trying to become whole again, he's rejecting this notion of becoming whole again.
Yeah, I mean,
what are your
there
thoughts
is a
on that?
rejection of cure, right? Because there is the whole clinic where you have the doctor, you have this the philanthropist, Ellie, right? And she is trying to correct his spine, and he's suffering from scoliosis, and that kind of also has symbolic resonances, and she's trying to cure him and again turn him into a kind of normative body, and he rejects all of it.
And I think the other thing is the gas leak is not a one-time spectacular event. And I think in your conceptualization, you're also saying it's not slow violence, but toxicity is something that lingers, right, in the bodies, the landscapes, structures of power. So, how do you view the body in this sort of contextualization of Sinha's work?
Couple of things. One is, yes, I mean, I'm not denying the validity or the use of the rubric of slow violence at all. I mean, because clearly, I mean, there is a persistent quality to toxicity. I've also worked on new radioactive sites. So one of my articles looks at photography of animals and wildlife in radioactive ecology. Even if you look at the nuclear or any kind of chemical waste, it has a very long life, right? It persists and it transforms and it continues in various ways as sort of embedded in bodies and in the social sphere. So I'm not denying, of course, the slow violence as a mechanism or as a rubric, but what I feel is happening in whether it's waste tide or Bhumingi's manual compoundizing, these are the texts that I'm looking at, or even Teja Shah's Between the Waves, that installation where she has dancers performing on landfills. That there is an attempt to visibilize waste, and that's where the kind of questions begin to emerge. That's from where the questions begin to emerge. That what happens if we treat waste as something that we cannot relegate to the margins? Now, the body in that sense, so this is why I'm saying this is because the body is not a site of inscription. So it's not this passive, brute, inert matter where discourse goes and kind of writes its narrative. But at the same time, it is also a historical. It is the body becomes a site where these histories of exploitation, extraction, inequities are preserved. But they are not preserved as, which is why phenomenology, I find that kind of again a useful optic, because these histories then get entangled with the body's own materiality, the body's own functioning, as for instance, the four-legged human janwar, right? And sort of and then what happens to these histories? How do they kind of get articulated? How do they get preserved? Because one thing that Sinha is very clear about, and a lot of contemporary speculative writers who are looking at environmental dystopias are very clear about, is that we cannot wish this away. So how do we tell these stories? How do we narrate these histories without reducing them to either a kind of apocalyptic scenario or by kind of creating this vision or remediation? This can be managed through technology or through intervention, right? So it's kind of the body that these are histories in limbo. Right? These are suspended histories. I like this concept of the suspended state, the suspended narrative, the suspended history.
In terms of,
I would say that if you look at the body, if you make the body as a paradigm here, it would be much more fluid because these stories, these narratives, these histories, these conditions, they're also interacting with and intersecting with the materiality of the body. So I'm also simultaneously interested in the matter. So how, for instance, and there's this instance in the book where animal starts picking the scabs of his own feet and ingesting that. And it's while it is a comment on the dire circumstances, the conditions of his existence. It's also that site where the abject, the wasted, the toxic intersects with the skin, right? So the epidermis itself becomes it's no longer purely human or purely anthropocentric. It is what harbors that waste, and it becomes part of embodied experience. Or even the relationship with the dog.
Yeah, that's clear in your work that toxicity is not just a destructive, but it's generating new forms of damage sort of life. How does that resonate with your larger studies of multi-species solidarities in these sort of exclusion zones or speculative media or literature?
So most of the speculative narratives that I have explored kind of see the damaged ecology or the ruin as a space for fostering multi-species. Because going back to the concept of survival, right? Survivance or survival. It's the ruin also becomes a space where you realize two things. One is that you're a porous subject. You cannot continue to remain in this kind of citadel of isolation. You also realize your interdependence on other forms of life, not just for survival, but also for thinking of your own identity as a subject. And so this whole idea of inhabiting a shared space becomes extremely poignantly so, prominent in these spaces. So the kind of the extinction ecology or the ruin or the damaged ecology as a space that fosters, it becomes a space for thinking about multi-species relations, but no longer in that hierarchical mode, So, which is also my problem with conservation narratives or conservation discourse, because I am interested in interspecies narratives that dismantle the whole hierarchy of the human as needing to save. The human equally needs to be saved. We are living in a world where, in fact, the inorganic has become part of the organic. plastic is part of our bodies. So, it's sort of, we will have to rethink the hierarchical paradigm itself. And that is something that is enabled by destruction.
Yeah.
So that's the starting point, of course. And then, of course, this whole question of obligation, stewardship. And so, I mean, yeah, we're sort of dismantling the idea of hierarchy, but at the same time, we also need to recognize reciprocity and obligation and ethics, which is where that sort of opens up another can of worms. What is the ethical way to be in a multi-species space?
Do you draw on Timothy Morton's concept of hyposubject to think through forms of subaltern resistance? Yeah. How is disability in animals, people framed not as a lack, but another way of inhabiting toxicity? And how does the hyposubject sort of disrupt neoliberal sort of narratives of health?
Such a relevant question. So the hyposubject, I mean, Morton's conception is a new way of approaching the subject, which is a historical necessity because we are all diminished subject in the kind of the Anthropocene or Capitalocene or whatever you want to call it. But this kind of an endangered, precarious planetary state, it kind of becomes a historical inevitability that we are all, in some senses, diminished subjects. So the paradigm of the neoliberal paradigm or the Enlightenment paradigm of the humanist subject as autonomous, bounded, unified, conscious, rational, etc., that is no longer tenable because we are living in crisis formations right now. So we also need to think of the subject as in relation to that crisis. So the subject itself becomes a crisis formation. So the hypersubject then becomes a concept with which to explore subjectivity in a minor register, which then, I must sort of admit that my interest in Morton is this is very early. This was when I was exploring other ways of thinking about subjectivity. This also, we need to remember that Morton is working within a certain Western environmentalist discourse or philosophical discourse. So his application of the hypersubject may not work when it comes to, say, Dalit bodies or Dalit ecologies or even Black fugitivity. So that's something that I'm aware of. But having said that, I've found the hypersubject as a useful tool because for two reasons. One, it obviously gives us a new articulation of subjectivity in Anthropocenic time. And two, because it kind of gives that legitimacy or that space to disavow subjects, to forms of embodiments or subjectivities that are rejected or adjected or that do not fit within the anthropocentric norm. So disability is one. And disability in particular because I'm interested in disabilities that are again produced by toxification, by wasting. Mm-hmm. That's a specific kind of approach to disability that I'm using. So again, it's not a medical paradigm of disability at all that I'm interested in. In fact, in Sinha, the whole idea of disability is going against the medical model. The pathological body becomes a site of resistance. One is by sort of rejecting this whole narrative of what a healthy or a normal body looks like or what it should look like, and recognizing that health itself is an exclusionary idea that comes at the cost of other certain communities or certain lives and livelihoods. So and health is not a universal, and the universalization of health itself needs to be questioned. It's part of that problem. So that there is a very clear rejection of that. In these narratives where disability is posited as a kind of corollary of environmental damage. It also, in Sinha's work specifically, it is a site of empathy with the non-human, there is that particular moment where animal discovers that he is clairaudient and he can hear the voices of the unborn. So there is this aborted fetus in a jar that he sort of, it's happening inside a laboratory, which is again that kind of Foucauldian space of normalization and docilization. But within that space, it is his scoliosis that is kind of giving him this ability to converse with another non-normative body. And there's a suggestion that an animal can hear this because he shares that kind of that similar embodiment. So there is an attempt to demystify disability, to demedicalize disability, but at the same time also think of it as a form of embodiment, not necessarily as something that's a lack or that is an inhibition, but again as kind of as a capacity. So there it does that idea of passivity being a form of capacity, and so it makes him receptive to those voices, invisible voices, and so that the whole idea of slow violences or invisibilized registers. becomes kind of accessible through the mode of disability. Animals, it also, in this book, it also becomes also empathy as well. Empathy and interdependence and intertwining with the non-human, with the spectral. He also has this ability to, when he revisits that factory, he can hear, there's a line in that passage where he sort of says that he can hear the ghosts of the people who died there or the lives that were lost there. So again, it gives him a kind of ability to access that which is unrepresentable. And then it then raises questions about the limits of representation itself. So there is that. It also, I mean, the very obvious relation that he has of it's a kind of a filial relation of caregiving with the dog, and sort of his being four-legged. And throughout, and that's also very interesting that animality and disability are collapsed. There are two things that are happening there again. So the collapse is reminding us of the biopolitical paradigm, where one way of excluding the disabled is by equating the disabled or the racialized body with the animal, with their life.
Yeah.
So Sinha is alerting us to that. So it's a very clever tactic that he's using. But and it's also beyond that, sort of saying that this is a kind of, again, multi-species empathy or multi-species connection that the disability is allowed. So that those are just two instances off the top of my head, but there are several. But the book is very wary of, so on the one hand, kind of showing how the pathological body has been used as a kind of, either as a cautionary tale or as a kind of as a site of marginalization or exclusion, but also going beyond that and creating waves of resistance.